Hey everyone, Casella here. ARB's first fundraiser is underway as this episode releases, and I encourage you to check it out. If you can donate, that would be very cool, and just sharing it around helps a ton. We hit our super low starting goal really quickly in like an hour, and as this episode goes out, we're only about $1,000 away from our first stretch goal, which will let us pay our writers a better rate. We've got some cool rewards. It would really help to get the magazine and the podcast sustainable. Thanks so much if you already shared or contributed. Okay, on to the show. A critic is a creature who has views quite like a camel's. Flowers and fruit he scorns. In the flower garden of the honeyed muse he starves unless he finds a meal of thorns. Hello, and welcome to A Meal of Thorns, a critical book club from the Ancillary Review of Books. Each episode, we take a book, usually a speculative fiction book, and we ask a writer, a scholar, a critic of some kind to talk us through it. Today, we are reading Ernest Cline's Ready Player One, and I'm very happy to have Dr. Matthew Leggatt here on the pod to analyze and discourse. Matt is a senior lecturer in English and American literature at the University of Winchester. He's published a number of nonfiction books on topics that listeners would probably find fascinating, including cultural and political nostalgia in the Age of Terror, play in utopian and dystopian fiction, and he's also edited collections, including Wastelands and Wonderlands, Utopias and Dystopias in Film and Literature, which is hot off the SUNY presses as this episode comes out. Matthew is also the co-host of the podcast Utopian and Dystopian Fictions. And you can call all of that foreshadowing for our Ready Player One discussion. Matthew, thanks for joining. How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. I feel guilty saying that because I know already, having chatted to you a little bit, that that's not not necessarily how you're feeling. But yeah, apart from being pretty much under, I suppose, water pretty much because we've been drenched over the last sort of 5 to 6 weeks in the UK, my part of the UK certainly in the south. Not too bad, yeah. Getting through myself sort of a bunch of kind of podcasting stuff, which has been a lot of fun. And yeah, I've just kind of come to the end of a big batch of marking. So
congrats.
that's reason to feel good about life briefly, at least.
Yeah, well, that's good. Yeah, as I was saying before, we started recording, and as I say, pretty much every episode, like I'm doing like very well with a big asterisk that these times are rough. Before we get into Ready Player One, anything else you have been reading or working on that you want to talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading a bunch of stuff, really. I've recently finished Jacqueline Hartman's I Who Have Never Known Men, which I thought was particularly excellent. Nice sort of mysterious post-apocalyptic stuff. I've been kind of working on apocalypse and post-apocalypse on and off for a while, and I've got a kind of project brewing around that, so I thought I should probably read that, and very much enjoyed it. And actually, something a little bit more obscure, I've been reading Daniel Olivas's Chicano Frankenstein. So we're interviewing him for the Utopian and Dystopian Fictions podcast in a couple of weeks. And yeah, that's a really surprising text, I think, a mixture of some quite on-the-nose satire, not inaccurate, I have to say, but some on-the-nose stuff, and then some alongside some really intimate sort of nice writing. So I won't say much about it because hopefully if anyone's interested, they'll check that episode out. Oh, and then also something else is I read Snow Crash recently around Christmas. So that's Neil Stevenson, and yeah, I mentioned it because I partly read it because we had this interview coming up, and I was thinking it's a kind of Ready Player One sort of influencer, I think, in some way, and maybe a bit sort of like a halfway house between something like Neuromancer and Ready Player One. I thought sort of in between there. In some capacity, and I noticed that in your notes you'd made reference to it as well, so it wasn't just me sort of recognizing that, I guess.
Yeah, no, Snow Crash and Reamdy and some other works were very much in my mind while reading this, and we'll probably talk about that as we get into it. Is the Chicano Frankenstein, is that a recent release?
I think it's 2024.
Okay, yeah, I'll have to look that up, and I'll keep an eye out for your episode and put a link to it if it's already out when this comes out. Oh, that's very cool.
It's really interesting in relation to sort of immigration issues as well. So it's kind of a rereading of Frankenstein or reinterpretation of Frankenstein, but around kind of reanimation of zombie workers and immigration in the US. It's really a neat concept.
Huh. Oh, that's very cool. Yeah, I've been reading a ton as usual. I have a stack of reviews that I have been struggling to get written, and I'm feeling increasingly guilty about it because some of the books were really excellent. I've got to get the reviews written. Another one I was thinking about while reading this was K.A. Ternya's Black Hole Heart and Other Stories, which is it's a short story collection. It's translated from the Russian by Alex Schwartzman, and it's really good. It's a fun mix of, I don't want to say overly classic, but there are a lot of sort of like cyberpunk-ish feeling things going on in it, but kind of like at a slight angle. Some really fun stories. There was one that was really playing around with the idea of everyone having the ability to filter the world that they're seeing and sort of like select like what you're seeing, like what kind of world, sort of like what kind of skin almost you're in. And then it plays out in this weird, I think it's like a sort of like detective / insurance story where people are seeing different things and it's affecting how the plot works. But yeah, I really enjoyed that.
I'll have to check it out. It sounds sort of, my sort of thing is utopian fiction. So it sounds like that's a kind of take on that in some capacity. I feel a little bit like an imposter on this podcast, partly because I'm used to sort of doing the running of the podcast. So it feels weird not doing that, but also because so many of guests as I've listened to are super expert on speculative fiction. And although you've had academics, sort of, I suppose, pure academics on, you also seem to have a lot of kind of reviewers as well, people doing lots of reviews. And you guys just know so many texts in a way that I feel like I've got these like holes in my knowledge. I think because like as a teacher, I've got to teach lots of different kind of subject areas. So although I love spec fic and I, particularly utopian dystopian fiction is my thing, I don't get to spend all of my time on it. And I kind of feel like I've got these big holes.
Well, don't feel like an imposter, first off. But no, I know what you're saying. And it's something I've thought about a lot as, I'm not an academic. I'm maybe sort of quasi, independent scholar kind of thing. But it's something I think about a lot on both sides of it, at both academic conferences and at like fanish conventions when I see people talking, where there's this huge overlap of the Venn diagram between like quasi-professional reviewing and academics, right? Where we have this, like we look at literature seriously and like we have a lot of the shared sort of like touch points of what we agree the major things are. But then, yeah, on the scholarly side, there's not like the drive to like read everything new that's coming out because like, especially if you're a working, teacher or professor somewhere, you've got a lot going on. You're not going to read, the top 30 novels that came out this year every year, right? And on the flip side of it, I think on the sort of like more reviewer and more fanish side, there might be this sort of like completist drive. Like I've got to read all of the series or all of this author or all of the award nominated books or whatever. But that's not necessarily connecting to all of the things that aren't fiction or aren't genre fiction. All the works of theory, all the other books that play into those books. It sort of like kind of gets these two separate, I don't know if you could picture like silos that are Venn diagrammed and like there's a little bit of spillover between them, but I don't know, that's something I think about sometimes.
I'm particularly bad when it comes to, trilogy, sequels and kind of series. I rarely get past the first book. I kind of feel guilty almost. It has to be really good for me to pick up later books. And by the way, I suppose I should say, I feel particularly guilty then with that in mind for getting you, I suppose, to read Ready Player One because there are things you could be doing with your time that I suspect would be more fulfilling.
I try to avoid a zero-sum approach to reading because you can sit down and figure out statistically how long you're likely to live and then figure out what's your average number of books you read a year. And then you can know how many books you're going to read statistically for the rest of your life and really get in your head about, like, am I picking the right one? I try to avoid that, You go where things take you, and I have been avoiding Ready Player One since it came out. I have been like pushing it away with a 10-foot pole. Many of the book clubs that I've been involved in have read it. Many of my friends have recommended it to me, and I've just been avoiding it. I kind of tell, and I'm really glad this brought me to it. Genuinely, like I think my opinion of the book will be very clear as we talk about it. But I was glad to come to it. So let's dive in. I want to talk about this book. So this is we're talking about Ready Player One. This is Ernest Cline's first novel. It was published in 2011 by Crown Publishing. And for those of you keeping track of the Big Five, Crown has now been completely absorbed by Penguin Random House. Set in a fairly dystopian 2040s that's not too wildly different from today, it doesn't feel like. Ready Player One is about an impoverished young virtual reality gamer, Wade Watts, who, along with many others, becomes obsessed with this contest set up by a now dead billionaire. Anyone who can solve the puzzle, which is all based around 80s pop culture, will inherit a vast fortune and control over the virtual reality system that almost everyone uses. Using his encyclopedic knowledge of 80s movies, music, and games, and eventually teaming up with some other Easter egg hunters, Wade navigates challenges in the virtual and physical world to claim the prize. So Ready Player One was a big bestseller. It won the Prometheus Award, and it placed or was nominated for the Dragon, the Campbell Memorial, the Locust, the SF Site, and the Seon Awards. A Spielberg film, which Cline wrote the script for, was released in 2018. The rights for it were bought up like right when the novel came out. And Cline also wrote a sequel to the novel Ready Player Two. So I've been avoiding this book like the plague. I am kind of happy that we're talking about it. But tell me a little bit about why you wanted to pick this. This is something you teach and something you've read and thought about a lot.
Well, first of all, I will defend myself against this accusation, which is that there were a bunch of things that we did say we could look at, and this was one of them. So there were some books I thought we could talk about that I actually thought are brilliant books. This isn't one of them. It is a book that I have a certain fondness for, and I wouldn't have taught it over the last sort of decade if I didn't have that. But it's a very much a guilty pleasure read. And it's one of those, I kind of thought, well, A Meal of Thorns, this is a text that's certainly very thorny. I kind of felt like you would have some things to say about it. And I could see from your kind of reaction that you do. But yeah, I mean, I first read it, I think pretty much shortly after it was published, within a year or two, I should imagine. So some time ago now, I suppose. I suppose I also have that defense. I was younger, perhaps more naive. But yeah, I did love it on first read. It spoke to me as someone who, I'm just about to turn 40. So I'm Cline, I think I looked up before this, I think he's 53 at the moment. So he's maybe a sort of, decade or so ahead of me, but he's not so far ahead of me that all of his kind of intertextual references are lost on me. In fact, I think it kind of hits the sort of sweet spot for me in that I get about half of the intertextual references and the other half I kind of am interested and want to look up. So it sort of makes it a bit more interesting. I almost think if I was a bit older and I kind of knew everything he was talking about, it would be more boring actually, because they were just so thick with intertextual references. But yeah, first time round, I really loved the novel. And then pretty much every year I've taught it since, I have felt guilty about teaching it. I have kind of toyed with taking it off the module. This year I was exceedingly close to taking it off the module. So it's a Utopian and Dystopian Fiction module I teach. And I was going to replace it with Nana Kwame Ajay Brenya's Chain Gang All-Stars, which I thoroughly recommend. I think is a really interesting kind of Hunger Games-esque novel, a relatively recent publication. Would be much better, I think, on the module than this. But I blame you again, because the fact that we're sort of having this podcast about this novel, and the fact that it's actually this week, so I actually taught it yesterday. And I thought it's so well timed. I can't possibly drop it from the module like a day after I'm teaching it. So here we are, one more year of Ready Player One, but I think I'm definitely getting rid of it next year. I suppose I should say a couple other things about it. One is that it really sort of does intersect with my sort of research interests over the last few years. So one of my books was an edited collection, Was It Yesterday? Nostalgia in Contemporary Film and Television. This was a few years ago. I actually wrote a chapter in that book. My contribution was to write a chapter on Ready Player One, although it was focused on the movie. I published this year, in the last year, a book on play in Utopian and Dystopian Fictions. So in that sense, it sort of intersects between sort of play and nostalgia. So in that sense, it does speak to my kind of research interest quite nicely.
No, that totally makes sense. So I'll say throughout this conversation, I'm going to be sort of like balancing two things. And one are like my critiques and my sort of negative reaction. But two, and why I found this I did find this an interesting read and like a good pick to discuss, because the book sometimes intentionally, often unintentionally is, I think, striking really, really deeply at some weird cultural logics. which I'll talk to. But the thing, I'm going to try to get off my chest and then just like, we don't have to come back to it too often. I will probably fail at this and we will keep coming back to it. But one is just that the writing is brutally clunky. I have read worse books than this for sure at a sentence level. I have not read many published books that are worse than this at a sentence level. It's tragic. And I'm just going to say that and kind of let it go. The thing I was thinking about a lot with this was just reading level. This doesn't feel like a book for adults. The sentence level construction of this is below most YA that I read. Maybe we might actually talk about this a little more, but Cline has a kind of quirk to how he writes, and it is all from, the main character. So I do want to maybe put some authorial, distance there, but I don't actually think there is much, which is that this book is all about references. It's all about catching the illusion of something, catching that this is about a book or a movie or not very many books, but games, TV shows, obscure animes, comic books. And whenever one of them is named, it's almost never just there for you to discover. The main character or someone else will say either out loud or parenthetically in the text what that is. I hesitate to call them references because it's almost more like citations all throughout in this way that doesn't really spark, what does that mean? Because the very next sign tells you what it is. So setting aside the really, really clunky writing, I think what is so fascinating about it is this feels like such an interesting distillation and a successful distillation in terms of sales, right? And popularity, a certain kind of relationship to, I hesitate to say art, but relationship to media. This sort of like uncritical stance that the right thing to do is just replicate it, right? That the way that you engage with things is you just cite them. It's really fascinating to me that, so this book has heroes and villains, right? And it has like these bad guys, the Sixers, who are like this evil corporation that want to win the prize and make everything worse. But the book never really looks at the fact that this billionaire who set this all up, Halliday, who's this guy who's kind of like a Bill Gatesy, Steve Jobsy kind of guy. He's made all his billions off this really successful computer virtual reality / game system, and he has willed all of his stuff to whoever can basically recreate his obsessions, not in like a way that I want to like honor the movies that I love. We're even told like flat out that he didn't have discerning taste, that basically every film and movie that came out in this decade of the 1980s, he just worshipped. It's strangely non-evaluative. It's just this sort of like listing, collecting approach to culture. And the main character, who is, I think is fair to say, is like just a stand-in for the author, is into this and buys this model. And I think a lot of people who like this, something about this clicks with them. So I don't want to be like super harsh on this because it's clearly a way that like it does resonate with some people. But to me, it just seems like not just, I don't want to say bizarre, but it seems like a strangely empty way of interacting with art / media.
Yeah, I mean, I don't disagree with that. Yeah, these intertextual references, they're not given a great deal of status. They come and go, as you sort of say, in a flash. I actually kind of, before the film version came out, which I think was 2018, made by Spielberg, I did kind of feel like, well, I thought the film should be good, partly because it can do all the things that the novel can't do, right? Because the novel, by having this sort of deluge of intertextual links, is very heavy-handed with that. It will say like, okay, the doors sounded like the doors of the Starship Enterprise in in the Next Generation or whatever, and you're like, okay, right. It's very, as you say, it's sort of quite clunky. But I thought, well, with the movie, you can just put those Easter eggs in. There's almost so many of them, though, it becomes kind of pointless. I do agree with that, but I do think there is a sort of a level of satisfaction. So it is an enjoyable read in some capacity because it's a very quick, fast-paced read. It's 370 pages, but it flies by. It's very action-based, and there's sort of cliffhanger sort of passages, and it's kind of like almost like sort of a Da Vinci Code sort of. You're involved in it. You're trying to solve these problems or these kind of clues with the protagonist. So it has that sort of pace to it. And that pace allows you to look past, I think, the fact that these intertextual references are flying by without any interrogation. So you just end up enjoying them for that reason, I think. I mean, I'm kind of thinking out loud here about why I kind of did enjoy it. And I think it's because I didn't, first time around, I just didn't have time almost to engage with the politics of it. Not because I didn't have time to stop and think about it, but because the narrative pace is so quick that you don't stop and really interrogate what's going on the page, I think.
It made me think a lot because this runs so much on reference, on referentiality. It made me think a lot about, it was kind of like making me interrogate my own relationship to that, right? Because like I found the way that this approaches literature very annoying, even though like I like a lot of these texts, right? Like I like a lot of the things that it's pointing out. I'm a couple years older than you, so I'm a couple years younger than Cline. But, I totally got this. I have extremely fond memories of watching the original Star Wars trilogy with my family, things like that. These are deep memories for me, right? I was thinking about the satisfaction of getting a reference, getting an allusion, and there's sort of like layers to it. And I don't want to make I haven't thought about this enough to make a topography of reference joys or something like that. But there is just this, there's this surface level of just being reminded of a thing that you like that is about as far as I think this goes. Maybe there's more to it, but and I don't think that's a bad thing. It's not bad to be reminded of a thing that you like, especially if it's something you haven't thought about in a while. Every once in a while, I'm online a lot, and someone will just be like, "Hey, Rick, remember this obscure album? Remember this obscure TV show?" It's like, "Oh yeah, that rules. I love that album." You know what I mean? I haven't thought about it in a while. That's great. And this book is doing that a lot. As a sidebar, and I said I'm not going to just keep criticizing it, but it is very funny to me that it's sort of artificially creates this setup where Star Wars would be obscure knowledge, with maybe a carve out around some of the anime and some of the coin op games. Almost all of the cultural products it references are massively popular. And so it seems like it's trying to make a setup where that old 80s movie nerd jock distinction or nerd popular culture divide still exists in a way that I don't think has realistically existed in my lifetime. But it has such a shadow in the popular media of that time that it's sort of been projected forward. And I know there are a lot of people who sort of retroactively reappraised this book a little bit after Gamergate, right? Not to say it's has a causal relation or something, but this type of easily toxic gatekeeping, often kind of misogynistic creation of quote unquote nerd culture or geek culture is something that has some pretty negative sides. But let's put a pin in that. It just made me think a lot about illusion and reference and how much I love it. I love reading something and it makes some really strange, clever reference that you have to take a while and some energy to sort of figure out. Or maybe it's a reference to something that's so obscure that most people aren't going to get it. And then it gives you this little spark of joy, you're kind of oh, I'm kind of in the in crowd for this, right? And I genuinely love that, in a book. It was making me interrogate it because this book to me is I don't know, almost taking it to the absurd extreme and making me kind of question it.
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to sort of maybe think about that in a little bit more of an academic angle and to think about what it is about this novel that we might enjoy. And Megan Condis has written about the novel. This was, again, fairly soon after the novel came out. And you're absolutely right that it's been kind of reappraised. And I think, it's dated quite badly, actually, the novel, particularly in terms of its identity politics and representation. Although, it's not changed. The novel was still bad in the first place, but people didn't seem to recognize that prior to, as you say, Gamergate for some reason. But Megan Condis has referred to it as a ludic novel, right? Which is so basically means it's sort of spontaneous, playful. Ludic texts are, and to quote her article, not only about game playing, but they also require game playing and puzzle solving of readers. Now, I'm being a little bit, I'm less certain about this than I was. I've always kind of taken that as why I like this novel, because it can kind of involves you in that game. But I do think you're kind of right in that the game becomes a little bit meaningless because there's just so much of this kind of. In fact, I don't think that the puzzles are that easy to solve. You don't actually solve I mean, for example, you mentioned I think, I think it's in your notes anyway, that there's a scene where he has to word for word recount the script of War Games.
Mm-hmm.
You might go, oh yes, right, I've seen War Games, so this is interesting, but you don't know it word for word, so you can't like complete the puzzle with him in that sense. So I don't know that that's quite accurate. But she also writes this: Halliday's Egg Hunt, and by extension Cline's novel, serve as a classroom wherein student readers learn about the origins of gamerdom, test their knowledge, and prove their geeky credentials by demonstrating their mastery of the texts Cline identifies as foundational to gamer culture. So I've been kind of thinking about that a little bit, and I think that there are moments in the text where this happens and where it's quite interesting. So a lot of the references are, as you say, kind of obvious on the surface, not that interesting perhaps. But, and I'm going to quote a slightly longer section of the novel here. This is from page 176 in my edition anyway. It says this: Halliday was alluding to a famous 70s hacker named John Draper, better known by the alias Captain Crunch. Draper was one of the first phone freaks, and he was famous for discovering that the toy plastic whistles found as prizes in boxes of Captain Crunch cereal could be used to make free long-distance phone calls because they emitted a 2600 Hz tone that tricked the old analog phone system into giving you free access to the line. Now, it's a very clunky... Yeah, it's not beautifully written. You can't say that at all. However, I mean, I didn't know that. I mean, maybe that's just my ignorance. But I think, I kind of, it made me look it up, maybe go and investigate it. And it's a pretty cool idea, and it speaks to what I think is actually the one sort of joyous thing about the novel. And the thing that I do really like is its appreciation for early internet culture and hacking culture. So we tend to think of hacking today, obviously, as someone in their basement stealing my, my credit card details or whatever. It's got a pretty sinister, attachment. But, in the early days of hacking, it was, mostly anarchists or people that just kind of wanted to have fun, bring down companies who were perhaps, Robin Hood type sort of figures, who are maybe sort of, I don't know, they were heroes in some capacity. They were trying to break systems that were trying to keep people out. And that's been lost, I think. And what this novel, I think, is nostalgic for is, yes, it's nostalgic for all of these 80s cultural kind of touchstones. But more than that, it's nostalgic for the idea of what the internet could have been and what it promised to be in the 80s, but has now been kind of co-opted and corrupted by big business, by advertising, etc. So I do have quite a lot of sympathy for that. And I think that excitement, that idea that the excitement around this tech could still exist and could be reclaimed in some way, is something that I quite enjoy about the novel.
I think you're totally right there. And that's, maybe that's something I wasn't thinking about enough with this, but part of the reason that, well, let me back up. So this has a sense of how virtual reality works that I was thinking of maybe too harshly, as weirdly regressive or dated. One thing I was thinking about is putting this sort of on a timeline of some other major books about virtual realities. So, you could start with Gibson's work, Neuromancer, and then Snow Crash, which is, I think, 92. This book, which is written in 2011, set in the 2040s, or published in 2011, really isn't doing anything that didn't exist in some form when it came out. Like maybe some of the like the haptic suits and things like that. Those are a little, if they exist, they're extremely prototypical. So part of me was reading it was like, this almost isn't science fiction. It almost isn't futuristic in this very strange way. Like it wouldn't have been, most of the tech it's portraying and the sort of like the way the world works wouldn't have been super futuristic feeling in 2011, much less in 2040. And it's really not envisioning a virtual reality and internet, how that works in any way that significantly deviates from something like Snow Crash, which is like 20 years earlier, right? Which is a strange effect. And I don't even want to say this like as a critique, but it was just, I was thinking a lot about that I don't want to say failure, but that sort of like lack of imagination of what things could be. But I think maybe there is a very fruitful way to read that as actually just a nostalgia for the open internet. I remember what it was like to, find chat rooms and make GeoCity pages and like make random conversations with strangers. I had some of like my first best really like deep obsessive book discussions on like, like early like Yahoo group chats and things like that. And I remember in the early massively online multiplayer games, just that feeling of immense play, right? Like I played a little bit of World of Warcraft when I was an undergrad, and more than like the battles and the loot and all that stuff, just like walking around and seeing people, talking to them, going to these like exotic locations was really fascinating and fun. In a way that I literally have nothing I do on my computer that feels fun in that way now. So that's a nostalgia I can't really ding it for.
Yeah, I read, I can't remember the author or the full title, but I did read a piece relatively recently that basically said it was titled something like "The Internet Isn't Fun Anymore," and that sort of sums it up. I think one of the things you're kind of getting at there is this is a satire that doesn't realize it's a satire, and I think you can read it almost as emblematic of the crisis of imagination that we are experiencing today. I actually think the most dystopian thing about the novel is its core idea that if we have the technology, and perhaps we already do, to create these fantastical worlds, we'd end up recreating the 1980s. It's a pretty, science fiction I always think of as kind of forward orientated, and this is backward orientated, and that I think is quite bleak. Now, I personally, as a writer, I like to write about texts that I enjoy and that I think are really uplifting and useful, and so this is a weird text for me because I do enjoy it, but as I said, I also have these real concerns about it and what it kind of symbolizes, particularly this kind of regressive, nostalgic politics. And of course, the other thing that it's ways we could sort of revise it is post sort of Trump, and thinking about the idea of making America great again and the centrality of nostalgia to that political movement is again another way in which this novel is now being reread, I think, or should be reread.
Yeah, that like uncritical recreation of a glorified past, which is also funny because that's like one of Gibson's early big stories, right? The Gernsback Continuum, and like already interrogating how science fiction is more fueled on this weird totalizing nostalgia than an actual, its futurity is actually a look backwards sometimes. I was dealing with the downsides of nostalgia, like in fiction. That's a weird thing to try to grapple with. I was thinking about Ling Ma's Severance. I don't know if you know that one, which
is a really good novel. We should have talked about Severance.
It's a great novel, yeah. But the way that like has like a zombie-ish thing that is essentially like the zombification of repetition, right? Of like getting like trapped in these loops. And then, do you happen to know Helen MacDonald and Sin Blaquet's Prophet? I strongly commend it to your attention. Helen MacDonald wrote H is for Hawk and is sort of more known as a nature writer and a memoirist. But then she co-wrote with Sin Blaquet this science fiction novel. Also has some elements of sort of like X-Files /fic kind of thing going on, but it is about this sort of artifact, this very weird technology that is basically literally weaponizing nostalgia. Like it's sort of like calling up almost like the I can't remember what they're called, but the things that get summoned in Solaris, in Lem's book, just whatever people are sort of like obsessed with, sort of like takes on physical form in this very strange way. And it's a really odd, haunting novel, and it's connecting it very concretely to Empire. One of the main characters is sort of like a U.S. like special ops, like highly placed person, and is really connecting this idea that like what we use as weapons is sometimes this like attempt to return to the past. But I don't know, it's a tricky thing to deal with because I don't know. You've thought a lot about nostalgia in film and literature. So tell me what you think about that in this book. How do you walk this line between I don't want to erase the past, right, and I don't want to erase our connections to the past and the things that resonate with us, but that there's this real danger in it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could sort of go back to the beginning of the conversation a little bit, and you were sort of asking, well, who is this for? And it's quite unclear who this novel is written for. And I actually had this sort of discussion with the students yesterday. It sort of feels like YA, maybe, as you said, even younger than that potentially, and yet it seems also to be written for, you know, people of his age group, if you like, because it's aimed at, you know, if you are a YA audience, you're not going to pick up any really of the kind of cultural references he's making. I don't think that necessarily matters, because I think, you know, all people have that sense that as you're growing up, right, your parents are knocking on your door and going, why are you wasting your time watching this movie that you've watched 1,000 times, whatever, you could be doing something else, or why are you playing that video game? And I think, you know, that sort of sense is and almost the response being, well, actually this matters to me, or this is actually meaningful in some way. And this novel seems to be a kind of like articulation of that. At the same time, I do think it's weird that people would consume this novel if they don't know what any of it basically means. And this speaks to something that I've written a little bit about, which is this idea of like prosthetic memory. So this is a critic called Alison Landsberg comes up with this term, prosthetic memory, and it's about this sort of idea primarily that I suppose it's a bit like there's a kind of cultural memory that you can tap into that precedes you, right? I mean, most nostalgia, when we think about it, is nostalgic for something I've experienced. How can I be nostalgic for something before I was born? And yet, you know, Stranger Things, for example, massively popular with younger audience. You know, they didn't live through the 80s. And actually, you know, I love Stranger Things. I didn't really live through the 80s. I was born in the 80s, but I don't remember it, you know. So what are we tapping into when we're tapping into that? I think the answer is kind of tricky. Again, it goes back to this idea, is this a good thing or a bad thing? So Landsberg sort of positions it as a good thing because it's cross-generational. It's sort of, you know, and you can imagine, for example, a young person reading Ready Player One, and maybe their parents are about Cline's age, and they go, yeah, oh, that sounds really cool. Tell me about your childhood. Tell me about what games you played and these kinds of things. And it allows sort of generations to kind of speak to each other through shared love of a culture. Another way of thinking about it, though, is that nostalgia fundamentally is politicizing, really. You know, so when we think backwards, we tend to only remember the best parts of that. And so that's fine if you can go, I'm just being nostalgic. That's kind of okay, because you go, I recognize that's my nostalgia kicking in. I recognize maybe the 1990s, which I grew up in, were not actually that good, and I'm just being nostalgic for it because I was young and because I was carefree. I didn't have a mortgage and all that kind of stuff, right? But if you're a young person and this is before your actual physical, you know, actual memory of that time, you can't check yourself with that. You just think, oh, the 80s looked really cool. And the 80s looks more like the future, I think, than our you know, culture does today, weirdly enough. So one of the best things you can read if you're thinking about nostalgic culture is a book called Ghosts of My Life by Mark Fisher. And it's a beautifully written book. It's mostly about music. This is what he says about the 21st century, and I think it's quite damning. I sometimes bring this up with students. I feel a bit guilty about it because it's a little bit trashing their culture, which I don't really intend to do at all. But he says, while 20th century experimental culture was seized by a recombinatorial delirium, which made it feel as if newness was infinitely available, the 21st century is oppressed by a crushing sense of finitude and exhaustion. It doesn't feel like the future. Or alternatively, it doesn't feel as if the 21st century has started yet. Now, I mean, that's a really damning way of talking about 21st century culture. You know, I'm guessing he's talking about sort of postmodernism as a kind of moment where it feels like all of these combinations actually create something new. But by the time we get to the 21st century, we realize it's just repetition. And so, again, that's a really interesting way, I think, of thinking about Ready Player One, which, again, is a novel where the combination of all of these different sort of cultural touchstones don't really create anything new at all. They just sort of imply the deadness of the culture. And that's true on the level that the novel is, you know, inspires as a reader. But also you could think that the novel is quite smart in critiquing that, because it says, well, this future culture in 2040 or whatever is a dead culture. It has to relive the past, I suppose. So you could give it credit for that, perhaps.
No, that's interesting. And I think that that's sort of like another layer of that idea that like it's satire that doesn't know it, because it never quite verbalizes that. There's never like Wade never meets someone who is really into the music of the 2030s, right? Like it's as though it just doesn't exist at all.
Yeah.
So we never get like a little speech or a little standoff or a little argument, sort of like arguing for the present, like against this past. But there's also this part of the level of dystopia that it has that it doesn't know it has is that lack of newness, right? And it doesn't realize that like it like sort of at a meta level, like as a novel, isn't doing anything new, right? Like it's again like this is not really doing anything in terms of science fiction that hasn't been already done, 20 years earlier. As a product, it's not really as like a product of its time. It's not really doing anything new. It's just sort of like a looking back to the 80s. One of the things I kept writing in the margins was the phrase "never gets old." This never gets new, in a way it's kind of astonishing how much it doesn't invent anything new. But that's maybe like unintentional level of dystopia. And it's fascinating to have a book that has big obvious dystopian markers in ways that feel a little dated, like some of like the like overcrowding concerns, some of the way that's set up. It almost feels like, I don't know, like Soylent Green kind of stuff, population bomb kind of stuff. Also very strange. We don't have time to talk about like fossil fuel, like petropolitics in this, but very weird that like in 2011/2040, no one seems to know about solar power, but that's a separate thing. It has all these obvious markers of crushing poverty and inequality. There's the, I thought a lot about the breakdown that's implied that when the assassination attempt is made on Wade and it kills a ton of people, right, in his sort of like towers, like the stacks, the like RV kind of things they live in. And the police don't even investigate it. They don't even pull the bodies out. That's actually, I think, to me, like a really effective way of like indicating social breakdown, right? That like we don't even go in and check who was there. That's a pretty good dystopian marker. But then I was thinking about the things that this book doesn't realize are dystopian markers, like the lack of new culture, like the fact that the Oasis, so this big virtual world that everyone plays in, and that more than the money is the real prize, right? The real prize is we got to save this from people who are going to do something terrible to it, and maybe we can do something cool with it. It all runs on like these totally artificial microtransactions, right? Like you have to pay for virtual fuel for your virtual spaceship to move from one virtual location to another. Wade gets a bill for how many bullets he shoots out of his fake made-up gun. It doesn't realize that it has like this microtransaction libertarian hellscape as like the thing they're trying to save, right? Like this is the good version. And it doesn't know that. And in a way that makes the dystopia of it hit even harder.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think there is some serious flaws in the writing in that it's smarter than it realizes, because as you say, you can imagine a self-conscious version of this novel which does recognize that, which is truly dystopian and works quite effectively. Essentially, the novel minimizes its dystopia into about 3 pages. So I think there's, I think in my edition it's something like pages 16 to 18. It sort of lays out how the dystopia arrived and what it looks like, but then proceeds to spend the rest of the time just basically imagining this more utopian vision of the kind of personal recreation of childhood and the personal recreation, particularly of the 1980s, through this essentially online platform. But yeah, in that sense, I think it is not really a dystopia, as you say, but it does speak to the utopian possibilities. Going back to that point which I raised early on, which is what I like about it. And one of the things I've been writing about is play in utopian and dystopian fiction, and the fundamental point of that book really was to try to articulate the connection between play and utopia, because people tend to think of utopias as quite dull or workmanlike, and maybe dystopias are kind of exciting, by comparison, page turners, these kinds of things. In that book, I'm trying to argue, the reverse of that, really, that the utopias are fundamentally a kind of playful genre. And so I am really inclined, no pun intended, towards this idea that utopia is built on play, and that we need to be more playful as a society. I've been kind of talking to my students about that. We've been thinking about work-life balance, and actually one of the big problems with with our world is our obsession with work, and what are we actually producing through that work? We're producing more stuff that we don't really want, we don't really need. We don't even want to do the work either. So what is its purpose? And I think in a future world that's better, where we deal with things like climate change, for example, we have to confront the fact that we work too much, and we have to do less work, and we have to be able to play a little bit more. So I think I'm really inclined towards that. But as I said, all of these things are things that we're adding to the novel from outside. It doesn't realize it's doing that, but it does sort of prompt those interesting discussions.
I think that is a great time to take a really quick break. All right, we are back. I have so many thoughts. We're still talking about Ready Player One. I have a lot of stuff bracketed here. Oh, one thing I wanted to mention, just because you mentioned this having a sort of interesting utopian angle, that actually gives me a little bit of a recuperative reading of some of the style things that were bugging me. Do I mean reparative instead of recuperative? One of those. Where in a utopia, like classically, a flaw that is often leveled correctly at them is that it's just kind of someone walking you around and pointing at stuff and saying how it works, right? Like, this is how Erewhon works. A lot of utopias are just like, we've perfected it. Let me walk you around and explain how it works, right? This is Walden Two, right? And I was complaining a lot through this book about how the narrator is often just sort of like walking us around how things work. Like, it has 10 or 15 different passages where Wade just explains, then I put the headphones on. The headphones connects to this Wi-Fi thing. It goes here and does this. And it was really bugging me, and it still bugs me. But looking at it as a utopian angle actually kind of makes that work a little better for me. That's interesting. I'll ponder that in my brain. We had a bunch of stuff we wanted to talk about real quick. One thing I just wanted to throw, maybe is my last big swing at this. There's a sort of lightly skipping over one of its cultural allusions that I found so revealing that I had to put the book down, which is how it deals with the Voight-Kampff test in the scene where it seems as though he's about to recreate a scene from Blade Runner. So these puzzles that Wade is having to solve, they involve decoding messages out of passages, playing sections of old games, recreating entire movies from memory, all to sort of lead one clue to the next, and then once you get the final Easter egg, you win the big prize. And there's this scene where Wade figures out that he needs to go find an object / a scene from Blade Runner, which is the Voight-Kampff test. And what I was stealing myself for as he goes to the virtual recreation of that scene, and he blasts his way in there, and he comes up to the thing on the desk, and I was like, okay, we're gonna get another thing like War Games, where we're going to get a couple pages of the character just acting out from memory exactly this scene, which, as a side note, is it's so weird to frame that as play, and it's so different than acting or playing music or, doing improv or standing up and doing a sketch, right? Very different to I just need to exactly mimic it. It's almost anyways, put that aside. But, so I'm stealing myself for this scene with the iconic film Blade Runner. And it doesn't happen at all. He just immediately skips. He puts the key into the machine. He immediately goes to the next thing. And I don't want to make too big a deal of this, but the Voight-Kampff test in Blade Runner, as adapted from Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, is a test for empathy. It's how it tests whether you're a human or a non-human replicant. And it's the only thing that this book skips. Just flies right past it. It almost feels like a tell. I'm sure it's just a pacing, timing thing. He was less interested in it. But it's so funny to me that this is the one thing where it felt like it could really engage critically with one of its things it's picking up. Because it doesn't take any real anti-war sentiment from War Games, right? It doesn't take any of the messages, the many messages that are contained in the many different pieces of work that it's engaging with, it just sort of name checks them. And this is one where I feel like, oh, wow, that would be so interesting. And it just jumps past it. I just wanted to flag that.
Is that you doing your own bit of gatekeeping, though?
I think so.
It didn't deal with Blade Runner in the way I wanted it to deal with Blade Runner.
That's right.
No, I just want to go back to actually something you parked a little bit there, which is it feels weird to call any of this play because, maybe I am being too kind of positive about this text. I mean, one of the things I've been interested in is this idea of exactly sort of pinning down what play is and trying to define it. And one of the best ways I think to do that is to think about why we play. So for me, at least, sort of educational games, gamification, labor, as it might be called as well, forms of labor that are also sort of playing on or riffing on forms of play are not really genuine play. There's a really good book by Bernard Suits which lays out the kind of philosophical definition of what a game is. And it's actually a really clever book that plays around with kind of philosophy and does it in an imaginative way. But he's sort of, one of the key distinguishing factors for him is this thing he calls the illusory attitude. You've got to have a desire to play the game, a willingness to play the game, a reason to play the game that's not in some way coerced. And so he sort of imagines that in a utopia, the only thing you would do would be to play games because everything would be a game. So in a true utopia, all of the kind of instrumental needs would be solved. So you wouldn't need to earn money to live. So you therefore, if you wouldn't need to, have a house, buy a house, you'd be given all that. So for example, you could build a house, but you would no longer be building a house. You'd be playing a game. You don't need that thing. So I think it's kind of really interesting. But here it's kind of, again, it's turned into a kind of form of work, right? Because at the end of it is still this big carrot of, of gaining control of the oasis, but also this kind of financial reward. And but I think, going back to sort of utopias as playful, one of the most interesting utopias from the 20th century, from the 1970s, is called Ecotopia by Ernest. I don't know if you've read it, but it's actually, I think it's in the afterword to Ecotopia. Kallenbach writes that, quote, "Constructing an imaginary society is a little like designing a game. The society evolves rules, principles and conventions, and the author is not entirely in charge." And so this is why I kind of feel that utopias are fundamentally fun and playful, and why I kind of am drawn towards the fact that this novel spends most of its time imagining a utopia, but it does sort of, it does reduce play to another kind of form of work in some capacity, which I don't quite like.
I mean, there's that moment where, Wade is still at the end of his high school career, and he thinks, like, my only way out is to find the Easter egg, in this way that feels very much the way, like, people might think, oh, I need to play the lottery, that's my only way out. Or I need to get a football scholarship, that's my only way out. Or like, I need to join the military, that's my only way out. If you come from a poor, at least my experience of, growing up in a pretty poor community. And yeah, and then to identify his only way out as a form of play from there on out, there's an obvious dissonance there. How he has to support his habit and his lifestyle with basically like advertising and sort of like influencer adjacent sort of activities, that actually takes up like a decent amount of a few chapters of him explaining, like, here's what I have to do to be able to afford all the things I'm doing. And it does feel bleak, and it does take away from that idea of it as being a game.
Yeah, I think the one thing that I do get from the novel that is, again, positive, is you do get a sense that Cline generally he loves this stuff. He genuinely loves it, and you do get that enthusiasm through it. That is one way in which that sort of spirit of play perhaps transcends the actual, what the narrative says about play. In fact, there's a lot of things about this where I think what the narrative actually says is not what I tend to take away from it, partly because I don't like what the narrative actually says and prefer other readings of it. I know that links to something else we were going to talk about, which we haven't yet touched on, which is it's kind of regressive identity politics, which feels like something maybe we ought to say something about, because it's not a very pleasant topic, but it is one we should at least nod towards, I think.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I mean, people have written quite extensively on this, but, if listeners are not familiar, this book has casual seems like the wrong word, but it feels like it's being casual in its misogyny and its homophobia, its transphobia, its body image, and how it treats people of color. It just has a lot of weird things that are really quickly tossed off, and I don't find it diegetically weird because these are like high school gamers, like I don't find it that odd, but it is strange that the author hasn't thought more about it or stepped back. There's no like growth from it. And so there are a couple sections that are just really, really gross. And how the quote unquote love story in here is just kind of like a textbook toxic. This is not actually a romance, but you think it is, and you're trying to make it one by force of will. It has, I think you would put in your notes the line that on first read sounds slightly hopeful, but then we think about it less so, that virtual reality has been like a boon for women and people of color. But it's been a boon for women and people of color because they can go in the closet and act as a white man, and get ahead. And that's pretty bleak.
Yeah, it's really dispiriting. I mean, it sort of echoes, the idea of kind of passing, in the US and under segregation, the idea that you would need to, in order to access the privilege that white people have, you'd have to pretend to be white. I mean, it's really quite thoughtless, I think, in the text. And it's not just that as well, but there's a really great article by Philip Nell. It's not an academic piece, it's a journalistic piece, I think, that came out fairly shortly after the novel, which criticised the novel for its, not just what it says about this, but also all of the intertextual references. It's a very, very, he calls it a very, very particular apolitical white culture. It's a 1980s, he says, without politics. So in that sense, it's notable that the biggest selling music artist, for example, of the 1980s was Michael Jackson, not mentioned at all in the novel. And this is actually something that Spielberg recognized. So when he adapted the film, there are flaws with the film, but he did at least recognize that its identity politics was quite poor, because he did have a reference to Michael Jackson that he deliberately puts in there. But also, as you sort of alluded to here, Wade's best friend, H, turns out to be an African-American lesbian, but is masquerading, as you say, as a white guy, straight white guy. But in the film, he has, or she has rather, an avatar that is dark-skinned, is maybe slightly androgynous as well. So I think he kind of, Spielberg must have been looking at it and cringing a little bit as he was trying to adapt this thing, because he's clearly sort of responded to that as well, subtly, in the text.
I don't know that we have that much more to say about it. Just maybe just kind of feel bad not noting it at least a little bit. Yeah. So, yeah,
I think it needed to be mentioned. And where I suppose we could think about a bit more about it, or where the text is sort of interesting, is this idea of the kind of double bind of anonymity, right? Because the utopian aspect of it is you can escape gender, or you can escape your race, etc. It's kind of like this. Seems to be a kind of utopian way of thinking, but as we've kind of seen, anonymity online has actually produced quite a toxic culture in which people just abuse one another freely and say things they wouldn't ever say in person. So I don't think in the book's defense, I don't think it was like that in 2011. I mean, it was there. The seeds were there, but our toxic culture hadn't really fully emerged by then, I don't think.
It wasn't undeniable the way it is now. Like, I think some of the markers were there, but you could also see still holding on to an idea that this will be a freeing, leveling, democratizing presence, which I still maintain, when things change and things keep changing, it could be again. So one kind of like last thought I wanted to throw out about this before we move on is just when you're talking again about how some of the play and some of the illusions work here. This is just reconnecting to me with what we started our conversation talking about, this kind of interesting difference between the way working academics and critics approach the field of speculative fiction, and also thinking about how this book made me think about the pleasure I take in catching references. And just, I don't have a definitive thought here, but I'm thinking now too, especially like, before we started recording this, I was on the Ancillary Review of Books Discord, and just chatting with a couple people about some things. And the way that, like, you do get this feeling that even though, I will ding this book all day long for its actual words. There was, the podcast 372 Pages I'll Never Get Back. This is Michael J. Nelson co-hosted. It's an entire podcast that started with, I don't know how many hours, 20 hours of podcasts that go through this book page by page, just taking it to task for how bad it is. But setting that aside for a second, getting back to this idea, this question I think is going to stick with me of when you're around other people and you know or you hope that you share an interest, like you just want to find a way to talk about that. And sometimes you don't have like a thesis, you don't have a theory, you don't have a deep insight. You just want to say, Raiders of the Lost Ark. What a film, what a picture. You know what I mean? And just, you want to mention this album that you just think is really cool and just sort of like revel in that together. And I think that is a tension in fan culture. That's a tension in how we approach art generally, is that you have a part of yourself that wants to celebrate by repeating, right? I get to think when I find an album that I really like or a song I really like, I will listen to like just that one album or just that one song like on repeat. Right. And like there are books that I love that I come back to because I need to read this section again. I just need to kind of work through it again. Right. This tension of the obvious pleasures and the less obvious perils of rehearsing and repeating instead of doing something new, instead of saying something concrete and just sort of taking this other piece of art or this other semi-corporate produced product and making that the only thing that's in my brain instead of something deeper about a relationship to it. I know that's a challenge. I think that's a challenge I think about in criticizing. I've often said that like it's much easier to write a review of a book I didn't like or a book that I thought was middling than a book that I thought was extremely good. It's really hard to write something critical about something where just I really just think you should read this. Like if I could, my review would just be I would read it aloud to you. But that's not adding anything to it, right?
Yeah, I think in general, my career to date has been a journey from being someone who was critical of particular texts and writing about those to thinking gradually, I think, why invest my energy in this particular text, which has for me not only no merit, but something I actively dislike. And I think particularly coming out of my job as a teacher, as a teacher, you want to share texts with students that you love, and you want to. It's a bit like when you sit down and watch something with someone, and you're watching it for the fifth time and they're watching it for the first, and you're looking at them. You're just you're wanting to see what their reaction to it is. And I feel like that with teaching. I always say, well, one of the great things about university degree, for example, is we're setting the curriculum. So we're saying, I want to share this with you because we think it's interesting, because we love it, not because I think it's a problem. So when I kind of set Ready Player One, I kind of feel a bit guilty because I do think there are problems with it, but I also know that there are some students that come out and really love the text and does sort of speak to them in some capacity. I also think this something you said a moment ago gives me an opportunity for a bit of self-promotion. So I'm going to take it. On the podcast, quite a few episodes ago now, we had Jordan Carroll on. It was a brilliant guest, and he's been writing about speculative whiteness in science fiction. And one of the things that came out of that conversation we had together was this sense that it slightly unnerved me, I think, that as people who love science fiction, we tend to think that other people who love science fiction are like us, or are particularly politically inclined towards the same things we're politically inclined toward. So he's been writing about the connection between fascism and science fiction in a way that sort of bothers me, because I kind of think, of course, people who love science fiction are not inclined towards fascism, because so much science fiction sort of pushes back against that. But this sort of sense that he sort of discovered was unnerving, was that I'm reading the same stuff that these other people are reading, and they're taking quite a different kind of message from it. And I think that's something that perhaps we could think about here. Is there a chance to be, even with this novel, it's pretty regressive and conservative in its politics, and yet it was massively popular. Maybe that's something that should concern me a bit more when I'm teaching it. What message is it actually sending?
I think that's a great point, and I think I wind up quoting. What's the Nick Hornby novel? Drat. How did I just blank on that? With the film with John Cusack? High Fidelity. Thank you, Brain. There's that recurring bit in there, or those, music geeks, who are like obsessive music listeners, and do very similar to this book, do this sort of like macho one-upmanship that's maybe a little bit like neurodivergent coded of like just name stuff, and then you've got to hit back with like a fact about it, right? Like, how can I show that I know more obscure trivia about this thing than you? And that's how we express our love for this thing, which is, it's in this book. It's a weird thing. I also get the pleasure of that, at the same time. But that has this recurring bit in it about talking about potential romantic partners. Is it what you like or what you are like? And in any space of fandom or shared love for a thing, it maybe doesn't call itself a fandom, I think there's this tendency to assume that people who like the same things as you are also going to be like you in these other ways. And that's absolutely not guaranteed. And maybe there are, forces in the work that sort of statistically push it one way or the other. But I'm often kind of flabbergasted to meet science fiction fans who, are, even if they're not conservative, maybe they're not pacifists. Maybe they don't have some of like the specific politics that I was assumed. Like, I was like, we're here at a book club about Le Guin, like, how can you not? Yeah. And people can surprise you. And this, I don't know, this book is making me think about that drive, and I don't want to discount it, that drive to like form community around the things that you love. But that's not enough. You've got to have other components to it as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like we're maybe wrapping up.
We should probably wrap up. Yeah. So Matt, thanks so much. Honestly, like, I have been avoiding this book for how many years now? For 15 years? I have been avoiding it, and this was really interesting to read and think about and to talk about. I really do appreciate it. Before we go, do you want to remind listeners one last time, first off, about the book that has just come out when this episode comes out, and second, about your podcast and where people can find you?
Well, yeah. So I've got a couple books actually. One that's I suppose I've mentioned on the already, playing Utopian and Dystopian Fiction, which actually came out in August 2025, so relatively recently. But I've actually got a new book coming out, an edited collection. It's got some wonderful authors in it, particularly around this sort of dystopian and utopian kind of divide, if you like. And the book's called Wastelands and Wonderlands. We've changed the title of the book, so my automatic tripping off the tongue is not quite right. Wastelands and Wonderlands, Utopias and Dystopias in Film and Literature. And that's coming out with SUNY Press, so in April, and I'm guessing that's probably when you're listening to this. So and the podcast, I co-host it with Liam Knight from the University of Birmingham, and yeah, we've I think we're at episode as we're speaking, episode 20. So we're a little bit behind you. We started about the same time as you, but you're a bit more prolific than us, so we've kind of dropped into the once a month sort of routine.
In the interest of preserving play and utopia and not labor, I applaud your restraint.
Yeah, we started off really sort of like confidently. Yeah, we're going to do it every couple of weeks, but there's a lot of work that goes, as a lot of work that goes into this. And we, like you, we have a different guest each week, and they're primarily academics, but sometimes we get kind of novelists on as well, or novelists with particular expertise. So I mentioned already, we're going to be speaking to Daniel Olivas, but we just had an interview with Paul Hardesty, who's the author of the Forcing trilogy, but he's also a climate scientist. So we kind of were thinking about sort of the intersections between climate science and speculative fiction. But yeah, there's a whole host of some stuff. So we tend to not to do things around a particular text. We tend to do things around a kind of theme each episode. So maybe the theme might be kind of utopia and the law, or dystopia and play, or what have you. So, but yeah, if you can, if I haven't put you off through this interview, check the podcast out, and we'd love to hear from you. I don't know if it's Utopian and Dystopian Fictions. I don't know if I actually said that.
Found wherever fine podcasts are found. Matt, thanks so much for joining me. I hope that your chilly lakes give way to spring and summer at some point here. And yeah, thanks again.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been great.
A Meal of Thorns is a podcast from the Ancillary Review of Books, an online magazine founded to address the radical possibilities of criticism, with a focus on speculative fiction, world literature, and utopian impulses. Go to ancillaryreviewofbooks.org for regular reviews, essays, interviews, and more. Our opening poem is by Bartra Hari, translated by John Bruff. Our music is by Giselle Gabriel Garcia. Our artwork is by Rob Patterson at The Ratio Farm. If you'd like to support the podcast and the Ancillary Review of Books, congrats! You may be good. A few different ways you can do that. You can join our Patreon. Throw us a couple bucks a month to keep the podcast and the magazine sustainable. You can hang out with us on Discord, and we've got a few other perks on the way. If you're interested in a book we mentioned on the podcast, buying from the bookshop link in our show notes or at the ARB website gets us a cut. It helps immensely if you just help get the word out about the show. Leaving a review, commenting, or sharing on your platform of choice, that really helps. And it's nice to know you're listening. Questions, suggestions, elaborate compliments, drop us an email at mealofthorns@gmail.com, and you can also follow us on Blue Sky for however long that stays cool, and probably slightly past that. Next time, I am talking to critic and cool book person Molly Templeton about Joe Clayton's Moongather. Lots of other cool folks and cool books on the way. As always, check the website for show notes and upcoming titles. And again, please don't forget to check out the ARB fundraiser. Thanks for listening, and stay critical out there. I need to pause really quickly to call my producer. Hey, Joe. Come here, Joe. Hi. It's okay. There's nobody out there. It's okay.